This video is a continuation of a presentation prepared for distribution to the Missouri State Historic Preservation Office to determine if there is enough information about the halfway house cellar to prepare an eligibility assessment to nominate the cellar to the National Register of Historic Places. Part one of this presentation covered the objective of the presentation, why the halfway house cellar is historically significant, where the halfway house cellar is located, the current condition of the halfway house cellar, and the landowners through 1866. Part two will continue discussing the landowners, describe alterations to the halfway house cellar, and potential future next steps. The following slides will establish the historical significance of the halfway house cellar, its history, and also discuss any alterations. The halfway house cellar is historically significant because it was used to imprison slaves in the 1850s and 1860s. The halfway house cellar is in Platte County, Missouri, between Platte City and Weston on Missouri 273. At the end of part one, we were discussing Bully Pitt's ownership of the halfway house property. Following is a timeline of written and eyewitness accounts of there being rings, chains, and shackles in the halfway house cellar. This is a spreadsheet combining written and published accounts of the halfway house cellar along with eyewitness interviews that were recorded. Over 16 people were interviewed about their recollections of the halfway house cellar, and a standard set of templates was used to ask the interviewees the same set of questions. Their ages range from 60-year-old to 96 years old, and as a caveat, their recollections are the best they have. Some recollections may have come from their younger days or even their youth. As we go through this spreadsheet, the little pink star will indicate a recorded witness interview. So here we have an early, probably the earliest newspaper article written in 1927 in the Kansas City Journal describing the halfway house and the halfway house cellar. These articles are quite detailed, and it appears that they were that the news reporters were able to get access into the building because they give us very good details, like in 1927, describing the halfway house cellar as being 27 feet long, 17 feet wide, and 10 feet deep. Also describing that there are 3 small slit windows of 24 inches by 9 inches in the cellar. In 1927, we're told that 8 of the rings were still in place in the cellar. And so in this spreadsheet, I indicate the witness, the best possible year for the newspaper article or the eyewitness recollection, and then whether they saw rings, chains, or plates, whether the cellar or arch was closed or open, their description of the height of the cellar and the type of floor, whether they saw outbuildings or the water well or unmarked graves, and then lastly, if they had any knowledge of what some would call souvenirs, but what others would call historical artifacts. Once again, we've got 1930 era news articles. And as we scroll through this spreadsheet and start observing the various observations, we're also able to start seeing a trend. And so here, we're going to talk about our first witness interview, and that is Paul Witter. He's a 96-year-old gentleman from Platte City who grew up on a farm very near to the halfway house. He was kind enough to give not one, not two, but 3 interviews to me about the halfway house and the halfway house cellar. And as an original free-range child, Paul got to roam the surrounding countryside and believes he first explored the halfway house cellar in 1936. So let's hear what he has to say about that.
Remember, they still had the chains in there that they, the walls that they tied to put on the slaves so they couldn't run away.
And where were those chains at? Let me show you a picture of the inside.
Well, I saw that. Well, they were just around in the walls. No particular plan, it doesn't look to me like, but they were just scattered around there through the walls, and I guess they could put them so that they could lay down. I mean, some of them were up pretty high.
Okay.
There weren't all that many, as I recall, but that doesn't mean anything because they've been there a long time.
How big were those chain links?
The chain links?
Yeah. How big were these links?
Well, you see that the chain in this picture, the long chain, that's kind of how it was with the big chain. And then I don't remember how it was fastened to the thing in the wall.
Okay. So
there weren't big, humongous things.
So then Paul also gives us a time frame for when the halfway house still stood and when the halfway house appears to have been demolished. And this is his story that sets when it was still standing.
I was in high school and I had was using my parents' car, and so I must have had a driver's license, and I had gone out with some friends on Halloween Eve, and we'd done stuff in Platte City and around. And I had to take one of the guys from north of Weston, and I took him home, and I was coming back, just me in the car, and I was coming down the hill in front of that house, and I believe it was still standing because all of a sudden my ceiling light came in the car. It had a short in it, I guess, and I'd hit a bump and turned the light on. It scared the crap out of me. And so that was, I was in high school.
So Paul's recollection on Halloween Eve that the halfway house was still standing is significant. We also know that on June 15, 1942, Katie Davis had sold the halfway house property to Annabel Hull Jones. And so Paul saw it standing on Halloween Eve, 1945. And then later, Margaret Cockrell and L.R. Vaughn both visited the halfway house site in approximately 1945 to 1950, probably 1946 for Margaret, and she distinctly remembered that the halfway house no longer stood on top of the cellar. At the time, though, she did remember seeing hooked things in the wall and chains, that it was a cave sort of thing. And so as we move on, we see other folks, including Verna Cowarts, who visited, she believes, the halfway house cellar in approximately 1951 to 1952. She remembered it being gated, that you could not go into the cellar, but you could look through the gate and see one or two rings and chains on both walls. Her recollection of it being gated actually matches with a 1930 news article that describes the entrance to the cellar as being an iron-grilled dungeon under the halfway house. Let's listen to Verna.
The cellar, it was like a cave.
Okay.
And it, to me, if I remember it, like I said, I was tiny. It had bars in front of it, so you could not go into the cellar. I'm sure it was there for safety.
Now, that's an interesting observation, Verna. I'm going to jump ahead. Let's see. This is 1930. And then within this 1930 article, they had a side photo that looked like this.
Yep, that's it. I remember seeing the chains. The bottom photo where the red arrows are pointing down on each side of the walls, on the left side and the right-hand side, there were chains.
These are just examples.
Those are more or less like what I remember in my brain.
Okay. And so you remember that ring, which was affixed somehow to the wall, and then the chains. Did you say that you don't remember the handcuffs?
The handcuffs, the hand shackles. There might have been one or two. They were not, all of the chains did not have them. And I'm sure it was because of wear and tear and the age of them. Maybe people had taken the cuffs. But I do know that the chains, the big round piece that attached to the wall was there, and the chain.
Okay.
Down. And Father explained what they were for. Of course, I was little. I didn't realize what was going on.
Yeah.
I wasn't even cool yet.
How did he explain that to you? What they were for?
He was tall, and I looked up. I was just looking straight in, and he just said, "This used to be where they used to keep slaves."
What's interesting, as a side note, about Verna's father was that during World War II, he was held as a prisoner of war in Germany. And I think it's interesting to think about what he may have been observing as he took his daughter to look in this cellar. Now we're moving into the 1956 to 1962 time period and spoke with Lloyd Martin, who had some recollections. By this time, he's describing the arch, basically, no house or anything on top of it. We've got a 1960 or 59 Kansas City Star article, which talks about the halfway house being a stopping point, and that there were iron rings set into the walls. But according to Charles Bless, those rings had been removed only recently. That's an interesting thought, because our other witnesses show or recall the rings still being in place. Margie Spratt and then others. When Scott did his investigation sometime as a young teenager or a boy, he attempted to descend into the unobstructed water well, but was then overcome with better judgment, and he aborted his effort. There in 1970, Suzanne Goodpaster and her husband were both school teachers. She taught in Platte City, he taught in Weston, and so they lived in a small tenant house, probably 100 yards to the west of the halfway house cellar. They moved in 1970, and they explored the cellar. And Suzanne definitely recalls seeing rings and pinions, chains, and manacles. She even saw a set of manacles or shackles laying in the dirt in the northeast corner of the halfway house. What Suzanne saw in 1970 was then corroborated later by local 101 members John Foster and Stoney Cox. Bob Matter and John Foster and Stoney Cox were all members of Local 101, who is the current property owner. And here we have John Foster and Stoney Cox describing seeing shackles, chains, and a spike in 1988 for John and 2010 for Stoney. So once again, we've got, a chain somewhere on this side.
Right about there where you are now. It was laying. There was a chain in there. Mm-hmm.
And it was
Going through the wall.
Hanging from the wall?
Yes, but it was just laying in. That was full of dirt then. You couldn't see it until we started scratching around in there.
That's an interesting observation, because I spoke to a woman who visited the cellar in 1951, 1952, and this area right here was where she basically remembered iron rings being mounted into the sidewalls. right at that level right there.
That's where those right above, maybe right about where that red line is about where we thought those chains were just laying on the ground, but there were some chains on the sides of it. And there was just a chain running through the rocks. And then later on, when we were digging some of the dirt out, we found that pair of shackles.
So let me jump ahead to this picture.
That's what those shackles look like.
Is that right? So let's see.
They were in worse condition than those are, though.
Yeah.
That piece of steel you showed me earlier, they looked like that, but you could tell you knew what that was when we saw them.
How wide do you remember, say, this portion being right here?
Oh, I would say it was an inch or inch and a quarter, maybe. It wasn't real wide. I mean, it wasn't 2 or 3 inches, but it could have been. It was 2 or under.
2 inches or under. Okay.
Yeah, it was more like maybe 1.5 inches or so. But it was heavy like that. I mean, maybe a 1/4 inch.
And you can tell that it was. Well, you could tell that it was handmade. It wasn't like modern manufacture.
Oh no, some old blacksmith had made that.
Yeah. How long would it have been?
It was probably 18 or 24 inches, but if you spread it out.
Okay. And the chain itself would have been how long?
If you spread them out, I don't know, maybe there was maybe 16 inches of chain, both pieces added together,
So the shackles that John and I were looking at are actually examples of shackles circa 1844 that were used in Georgia. And you might wonder what happened to those shackles that John found. Well, John said that his boss, Sam Long, came to visit the work site and to see the progress they were making on the halfway house cellar. And so they showed Sam Long the shackles, and he was interested in them, and he took them, said he was going to do some research about them, put them in the trunk of his car, and that was the last time John ever saw those shackles. The next video is going to be a clip from Stony Cox, where in 2010 he describes finding a spike in the cellar wall, which may be and is probably the same thing as Suzanne Pastor's pin that she saw in 1970.
Where I seen it was actually further to the north of where you're showing that. It was just further to the north. Come back just a little bit to me. There you go, right there. So it'd been right in that area right there.
Okay. And in this photo, the yellow line represents the dirt line that John saw it. And then we've got the chains that were embedded to the wall. And then this is where he found the full set of manacles.
Okay. Well, that would make sense then. That makes absolute sense. Okay.
And so there was just the one spike. It was metal, of course.
Yeah.
Iron, probably. How big around was it?
Probably maybe 3/4 of an inch, and it had like a slight hook on the end of it.
Is that right?
Yep.
And the hook was open?
Yeah, it was open. So, but it was something where, like, if you would have drove it into the rock, it would have been, if you would have drove it into the wall, it would have been sealed. But it was stuck out far enough that it was open. So maybe just the shifting of the earth and everything else, might have worked itself out a little bit, but it was not a closed hook.
Could it have been an eye at one point and a portion of the eye broke off?
Yeah, I mean, it could have been bent all the way around at one point, and then and it got broke.
And then it was still embedded in the wall when you saw it.
Yeah, it was still embedded in the wall.
So you couldn't, there was no way you could know how long it could have been.
No, not. I mean, I didn't. To me, it's history, and so I kind of like to leave that stuff alone. So,
Sure. Well, and so I'm thinking, it could be that there's still a portion of that spike, somewhere through the wall and somewhere, into the dirt on the outside.
absolutely.
Stoney later said during that interview that he went back up to the halfway house cellar 6 to 8 months later, and it appeared that the spike had been removed. So that is basically our spreadsheet of written and witness observations stretching back all the way to 1927 through 2010. At this point in time, there are no rings or chains visible in the halfway house cellar, but there is the potential that there may be remnants of the spikes still embedded in the walls of the cellar. So before we go a little bit too much farther, let's catch up with the Weston to Platte City Turnpike Road, starting at the end of Bully Pit's property ownership and going to the present. In these plat maps, we see the halfway house being depicted on the maps. And for the most part, nothing historically significant relating to the halfway house cellar occurred after 1866 in Bully Pit's ownership. The historical record records a lot of complaints about the quality of the road, but the road was eventually completed and the Turnpike Road turned into a public road. And then, as we see in this photo here, eventually Missouri 273 was constructed, and it bypassed the old Turnpike Road that would have ran through here, and instead it was moved to the southwest, and this is where the current road is, which in a way protects and secludes the halfway house cellar right there. So our next property owner is Albert Gallatin, or A.G. Williams, and his heirs. And in this picture, we see Laura B. Williams Hall, and then Albert's wife, Ella Owens Williams, also Laura's mother. This photo was taken around 1895 or so. So A.G. Williams was a slave owner. He came to Platte County from Monroe County, Missouri, after his residence was destroyed in a fire. They bought an estate called Hazelwood in 1854. He was a businessman. He had a livery business in Weston. As we can see, he registered slave ownership in 1850 and 1860. The three pink stars indicate the slaves that by age, sex, and color designation were likely owned in both 1850 and 1860. We also see in 1860 that he had a runaway slave. He eventually bought the halfway house property from Bully Pit on March 10th of 1866 for $4,200. Find a grave indicates that Albert bought and ran the Halfway House, a roadside tavern on the Weston to Platte City Turnpike. He died in 1869. The Halfway House property was bequeathed to his son, John S. Williams, and in 1897, John S. eventually sold the property to William Paxton. And as we look at this picture, let's focus on Laura B. Williams Hall, because we know that Laura was born on September 8th, 1861. And in 1941, Laura, at the age of about 80 years old, Laura wrote down some recollections about the Halfway House and the Halfway House cellar. And what's important to realize about this is that Laura was born on September 8th of 1861, and she was raised in a slave-owning household with siblings who had been raised in a slave-owning household. She was the youngest child of 9. She would have learned about the Halfway House and the cellar from her parents and siblings as a child, and then later on, when her brother John owned it, she would have been able to visit and explore the property. So here in 1941, she's calling the Halfway House a roadhouse, and she's describing the construction and layout of the building. And frankly, her recitation of the Halfway House property ownership up to 1942 is quite accurate. While she indicates the cellar was used as a wine cellar, she also describes how it was used. When she says, in the ceilings were 4 large iron rings where slaves were tied and tried, as was the mode of punishment of a few slave owners who were severe and exacting of their slaves. She also has an interesting little side note that they were finding bullets in the trees that were cut down for firewood, bullets that were left over from the Battle of Bee Creek in November of 1861. So now let's go to the next property owner, which a name we are familiar with, William Paxton and his heirs. Paxton and his heirs owned the Halfway House property for 27 years and 7 months. As we know from part 1, we examined several lawsuits that link William Paxton with Bully Pitt, and from those lawsuits we know he was engaged in both slave ownership and also slave hiring. He's quite well known in Platte County for his annals, which describe Platte County's history through pre-Platte purchase all the way through to 1897. His annals are a very key resource document for Platte County history. So we've got Paxton owning it between 1897 and 1925. And it's during his time frame then, time frame of ownership, that we actually get to see the first and earliest photo of the Halfway House when it still stood. And this was published in 1912 in the Platte County Argus Platte Purchase Route Edition. And this plat purchase edition, it was a multi-page supplement to the Platte County Argus that specifically advocated for the construction of a continuous road from Parkville to St. Joseph. And what's interesting is, as they're pitching this idea that we need a road, they're portraying the halfway house as being this mysterious and scary local landmark. But also what's interesting is that in this write-up about the halfway house, there's no mention of slaves or the dungeon. And then here's another photo taken during Paxton's ownership. This is George Newton and Mabel Cressup, and they're walking east past the halfway house. This photo has been colorized from the 1915 photograph. The original photograph still being at the Weston Historical Museum, but this kind of gives us a perspective of the way the halfway house looked, actually, and how close it was to the Turnpike Road. We can see the outline of the fireplace on the west end, and then there seems to be some type of door frame. Right here underneath Mabel's umbrella is the halfway house cellar entrance. Kind of see what may be a door jamb there. And then this slab laying right here askew could very well be a portion of the porch that used to run this length on this side of the house. So then the next property owner is Walter and Katie Davis. They owned it for 17 years and 2 months. Not much known about the Davises, but it was during their time period, 1925 to 1942, that the halfway house and the cellar started to get a lot of press and showing up in news articles. So it's from these news articles then we get really good details about the dimensions of the house, what it was made of, descriptions of the main floor, the loft, the basement, the tap room, and of course the cellar. And so here's a couple photos on the right that were colorized from the October 9, 1927 news article. Eventually, Katie Davis sold the house or sold the property, actually just a month or so after Walter died from injuries he's got when a horse-drawn orchard spraying machine overturned on him, and then Katie Davis sold it to Annabel Hull Jones. Here's another couple photos that were taken during Walter and Katie Davis's era. Here in 1927, the Platte County Argus is saying an old tavern famous in Civil War days, which of course would have been Bully Pitt's era. We see in this 1929 photos, it's falling apart, but it's still standing. And then here again in 1929, we've got the Platte County, Missouri Cornhusker supplement. And it was a supplement to the Landmark newspaper. And the halfway house is described here. This is where we get our little tidbit of information about the halfway house being used as a slave auction site where you wouldn't have to pay the slave mart fees. This supplement also talked about the iron rings to which the slaves were fastened while their masters bargained over them. Once again, kind of hinting at a slave auction setting. And here, even in 1929, they're saying they hope something is done to preserve it as one of the landmarks of Platte County. Once again, during Walter and Katie Davis's era, the St. Joseph Gazette does a very nice article, lots of pictures, lots of details about the halfway house and the halfway house cellar. We see this inset photo of the entrance into the cellar. This would have been from the south side. Here we get our reference to an iron-grilled dungeon. And like the other news articles, we get details about the construction and the use of the house, especially that it was a dungeon for slaves. Another news article was published. This one, the news clipping says that it was published in 1936. I'm kind of dubious about that, but I haven't been able to find the news article in the Kansas City Star. But nonetheless, we've got a good picture there of the halfway house starting to fall down. And as we see under that light blue arch, we see the entrance to the halfway house cellar as it sits there. So our next property owner then is Annabel Hull Jones, and she owned the property for 45 years and 10 months. So we've already kind of established that sometime after Halloween Eve 1945 and 1946, when Margaret Cockrell saw it, that the halfway house was demolished. We've been unable to locate anybody or any eyewitnesses that could describe the alterations after Halloween 1945. Local lore, rumor says that the halfway house was bulldozed and or it was burned. But we do know that as of 1951 through 1962, eyewitness descriptions of the halfway house cellar changed from being a dark and cave-like thing to an archway or open on each end. And as we've previously seen, we've got eyewitness reports, starting in 1936 through 1988 and even 2010, about rings and chains hanging from the wall, pins or spikes driven into the walls, and even a set of rusty shackles. We do know that a walnut beam was salvaged from the halfway house and is currently used in a Weston residence. And local lore also says that a stone hitch and stairs were removed from the site. And I think you may remember from part one, us discussing the stone hitch that may have been used at the slave auction site to chain slaves. So then in April of 1988, Annabel Hull Jones sells the halfway house property to the International Union of Operating Engineers, Local number 101, which I'm just going to say Local 101 after this. Here we've got a few photos from 1969. Bertha Bless had a segment about the halfway house cellar in her Weston Queen of the Platte Purchase book. And she discusses slaves being unloaded at Rialto and placed in farm wagons covered with hay and then brought to the halfway house. As she says, while their masters regaled themselves at the gaming tables and bar, the slaves were chained to rings in the stone walls of the cave. and the next day the slaves were auctioned off at the big front door. The photo on the right is Robert B. Jones, who was Annabel Hull Jones's husband, and this is a 1977 Kansas City Star photo in an article where he's pointing inside to the cellar, and maybe he's pointing at rings that are in there. So the next property owner, and actually the current property owner, is the International Union of Operating Engineers, local number 101. They bought the property on April 4th of 1888, and they have currently held it for 36 years. So I've spoken to 3 local 101 members that were involved with the site earlier, and the first person that actually saw the property and the halfway house cellar was Bob Matter. This was in early 1987 when the local 101 was out looking for property to build their training facility. And Bob Matter said that, when he first saw the cellar, it looked, very much, nearly exactly like the 1969 Bless photo here, this open arch end. It was soon after then, they bought the property in 1988, that Sam Long instructed some of his members and workers to perform work on the halfway house cellar to preserve and stabilize it. And so they got out there. John Foster and Don Owens were 2 of the 3 people that worked out there. They excavated dirt from inside the cellar, restoring it to its approximate original height. They enclosed the north and south ends using rock originally from the halfway house foundation. They installed the viewing window that we see. They built the alcove, the steps, and the viewing platform. They installed the iron railing and electrical conduit and brought electricity down there for outdoor lighting, and then lighting inside the cellar as well. They constructed an enclosure around the water well, which up until that point had just been a hole in the ground and a safety hazard. That enclosure was later torn down and replaced by an iron road plate. It was during 1988 and their work that they discovered the set of shackles, and they saw the hanging chains still affixed into the walls. They also constructed the stone fence posts that you see in the lower photo, once again using rock from the halfway house's foundation, but they found no evidence of a fire. I will stop and say right now that while the south side viewing area is publicly accessible, the north side behind the fence is private property, and you do need to get permission to go back there. And as we look at this, we can really tell how the original arch of the halfway house cellar is still there. It's just behind the stonework that was constructed by Local 101. And I think it is entirely fair to say that because of Local 101, the halfway house cellar has been protected and preserved. And I guess one side note would be that I think it's quite poetic that a labor union who is formed by workers for better pay, safer working conditions, and better benefits is the guardian of a place, of a site where slaves were imprisoned and auctioned. So now we're going to listen to some video clips of John Foster describing the work and the alterations that they made to this cellar in 1988.
Down there to the cellar, and the boss said, let's do something with this and preserve it. So we started carefully digging it out, and then we got a guy named Don Owens who was a operator, and I think he's passed away now. He was a rock mason also, and we dug that out, and then we made that window to fit in the back of it, the north side, and he laid some rocks out, and we set that on there. We just didn't want it to fall down any further.
And I had meant to ask you, I mean, why, and I think you referred to, you meant Sam Long told you guys to work on it. Why did he think that he wanted to preserve it? Did he ever say why he wanted you guys to do the work?
Well, he knew, and of course we all took orders from him, but he knew that it was something really old. And then when we found those chains in there, he definitely wanted to preserve it after that.
And this is an inset from that 1930 news article that shows the south side of the cellar entrance.
The roof of that is what was there when we got it.
Gotcha. So this is a photograph that was taken sometime before 1969. I don't know the exact date, but it was used in a book that was published in 1969.
That's what it looked like when we got it, and then a lot of dirt had fallen into the interior of it, and I dug a lot of that out by hand. It was a lot deep. See where the dirt is now, then you can only see the roof of it.
Yeah.
It was about maybe 3 foot deep inside of it, and then that dirt there where your cursor is now it was about where it is, but inside there was less dirt than you're seeing right there. You could get on your knees and probably stand, on your knees. Your head would be real close to the ceiling.
Okay. So you guys took a lot of dirt out of there to get it the way
Yes.
it is now.
And the dirt was on the edges. You could tell it had fallen in from the back and the front.
Okay. So when you excavated that dirt out of the interior, I guess a couple questions. What did you do with the excess dirt?
Just threw it out there in the front and the back. It was just old brown dirt. It wasn't good to grow anything on.
And you threw it on the north side?
No, we threw most of it out the front, and then of course we had backhoes and stuff to move the dirt around, after we pitched it out of there.
So the second question for the interior, did you guys ever excavate down to like a solid rock floor?
No, it was a dirt floor that I can recall. I don't ever remember being a rock floor in it.
So before we look at the next video, I think it's important to recognize where John Foster said they had thrown the dirt from inside the halfway house cellar, and that they had thrown it out and moved it on the south facing side of the cellar. So that gives us a clue that if there were where to find artifacts, if there were any in the dirt they excavated, where those artifacts may be deposited. Then Don Owens was the one who did all of this work in through here.
He's the one that you see those two pilings up there on top where the fence is running up to.
Yeah.
He laid all the way from down to Bee Creek up to the end of the property. We built those first, and then I became one of the business agents and left there, and was at the union office full time after that. And I think he did do all that rest of that rock.
Okay. You touched on it earlier, and where do you think he got that rock?
Oh, there was rocks scattered all over the place, and the good ones for building, they're flat, and they were just like the pictures show. Now I know where those rocks came from. There was an old rock foundation in a house on the back and the sides of that.
And this is definitely both, this entryway definitely has mortar, in it,
Yeah,
and that's the original.
because Don Owens used mortar to, place the rocks.
Sure. How much experience did he have as a stonemason or a rock mason?
Well, he was an operating engineer, and that was his normal job to run heavy equipment. But I think he built fireplaces for people and retaining walls and things like that for people
Okay.
on his weekends and when he wasn't working.
So we also know that beginning around 1990, Local 101 performed some fairly extensive earthwork north of the halfway house cellar. And in these next few photos, what we're looking at is a strip of land between the dashed yellow lines that appear to be undisturbed by that earthwork. Once again, we're thinking about where there could have been an outhouse, outbuildings, barns, stables, smokehouse, or even slave cabins, and where undisturbed ground might be to find evidence of those structures. For the most part, from the front of the halfway house cellar as it exists now, 150 feet north is undisturbed land. Here we're looking at what aerial photographs from 2002 and 2003, and then 2003, and then currently 2023. So there are a couple things that could be done for potential future investigations and assessments, and one could be a field investigation where we would take detailed measurements of the halfway house cellar to obtain baseline measurements that could be used in the future to see if it's moving around or stable. We could also probe underneath the dirt floor to see if there is something solid underneath there. We could also use a metal detector to sweep the walls to see if there's still metal embedded inside the walls that could identify the location of where the spikes were that held the rings. But we would not be removing or disturbing anything. We would also walk the site to see if we could identify potential outbuilding areas in the undisturbed portion of the land. And then, of course, set a datum reference point so that measurements and could be taken from a set point. Another thing that could be done would be to invite the Dry Stone Conservancy to inspect and assess the halfway house cellar to see what they thought about its craftsmanship, condition, and stability. They could also offer advice about historically appropriate repairs. And they're the only organization in the country dedicated to the preservation of dry stone heritage and the craft of dry laid stone masonry. So in conclusion, the halfway house cellar is historically significant. I think we've proven that it was used to imprison slaves. It's a unique landmark. There's no other place in Platte County widely known to have been associated with the practice of slavery. It existed during a period of Platte County history that is significant. It's a reminder. Gotta keep saying this. It's a reminder of the sin of human slavery, and I think the halfway house cellar should be on the National Register of Historic Places. So that's all we have, and thank you for your time.